I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session, and today we'll be discussing how we can build systems awareness in education. How do you help students recognize, navigate, and shape a world of profound interconnectedness? And what does that mean for the relationships and systems that we create? My guest for today is here to explore answers to these questions together with me in conversation, and her name is Mette Böll. Mette is a biologist by training, specializing in the evolution of complex social systems, mammalian play behavior, and philosophy of nature. Mette has a PhD in organizational ethology from the Center for Semiotics, Aarhus University, and holds additional degrees in contemplative leadership and the philosophy and history of science. She uses her training in these diverse areas to research how moods and feelings are transmitted in social relations and how the resulting relational fields in turn shape the larger systems we as human beings are part of, with a particular focus on education. Now, in 2014, after teaching neuroscience of emotions and heading research at Metropole University College in Denmark, Mette joined Peter Senge and Daniel Goleman. Their collaboration expanded and merged with other initiatives and eventually led to the Center for Systems Awareness in 2019, a global collaboration of master educators, leaders, students, and researchers. The work of the center is grounded in the core belief that education today must help students recognize, navigate, and shape a world of profound interconnectedness. So self, understood as the mind, body, and heart system. Other, such as families, friends, teams, groups, and the larger social, economic, and natural systems around us. Main projects include partnerships with universities, schools, and community organizations focused on building capacity for systems leaders in education, integrating compassionate integrity with school curriculums, and studying generative social fields at the classroom, school, community, and larger systems level. Mette currently works at MIT as a visiting research scientist, and she is co-founder and director of the Center for Systems Awareness. And today she's here to share about her work and her experience. So a very warm welcome to you, Mette. Thank you so much for being here with us in the summit.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I was pondering when you were reading all this, I was like, wow, it sounds like really interesting work. And I guess it's a good thing that I feel that way.
Would be interesting if your response were any other than the one you just shared with us. And I am really curious about your experience and what we'll be discussing today. And I'd like to start at the beginning of your career, because that's where you started with biology and with the evolution of complex social systems as one of your specializations. You had more, as I mentioned earlier. And what led you to study this particular area, this particular fractal within biology? Why did you want to study complex social systems?
Yeah. Well, so when I was very young, I started studying philosophy. Mm-hmm. I've always had this kind of yearning to understand. I mean, understand, the depth of living systems, understanding, why we're here, what we're doing here, all these kinds of questions, and what it's all about. And so I started studying philosophy, and it made me severely depressed. So after a year, I had a sense that, wow, if I continue on this path, two things will be certain. One, I will never be a philosopher. And second, I will end up speaking and dust will come out of my mouth. And I'm not saying this to to kind of put anyone down or say that that's the case for everybody who studies philosophy. But my yearning was not met, because literally what I had to learn was a lot about, how mainly men in the Western systems had been thinking about things for the last centuries. And so different from that kind of lived experience that I was after. Yeah. And so I spent a little bit of time trying to really figure out where in life could I, could that yearning for understanding and kind of diving deep, that kind of inner researcher, if you will, that's always been with me, where could that be met in a way where, I would thrive? And what kept coming back to me was this: my sanctuary in life has always been in nature and with animals. And I would literally be, that kind of kid that would just sit outside all day, and animals would come up to me and we would, connect. And I would save all of those little things that I found around that had, fallen from their nests or whatever. And so my grandmother lived in the countryside, for example, and they had a lot of wild cats, as everybody in the countryside. And she was always, after I'd been there, all the cats were no longer wild, and they were all kind of looking to get inside and wanted to be cuddled and all that. So that was a kind of, I saw some kind of connection suddenly where, the kind of where I had been the most free and felt the best in life when I was a kid could somehow meet this other yearning as well. So I decided I wanted to become an ethologist. An ethologist is somebody who studies animal behavior and animal behavior in a natural habitat. So literally, I read the old kind of, Konrad Lorenz, who was like a real visionary and pioneer in this field. I read Jane Goodall, who now is still doing all this amazing work with the chimpanzees and so on. And I was like, I want that. I want to sit out there in nature and come to understand more about life. Now, as you can imagine, in Denmark at that time, when you wanted to become an ethologist, they were like, you had to become a biologist and then you could specialize in ethology. And becoming a biologist was really not so much about trying to understand, living systems. It was very technical, right? So I had to do a lot of math and chemistry and biochemistry, and it was tough. And fortunately, what happened was, in my second year of studying, I took a course on epistemology for biologists. And there was a professor there, Jesper Hofmeier, who was a professor of biosemiotics, so literally studying the sign interactions of living systems, trying to study life processes, living processes as an intercoherent whole, instead of this very digitalized kind of reductionistic way that most people are studying it.
Yeah.
And it felt like I had died and gone to heaven. I was like, oh, there's somebody who's actually replying to my questions. Yeah. And I think he felt a little bit the same way. He died last month, and I gave a speech at the funeral. It was interesting because I've just revisited all of this, of course. And one of the things I said was, Jesper really didn't like students a lot. He thought it was just too much, they would never really understand, and all of this. And I was not really a very good biology student because I asked all these questions all the time that you're not supposed to be interested in as a biologist. So we were a good match, and I became his apprentice. Yeah. And so I had much more that role of kind of being, being an apprentice to somebody who was incredibly masterful in thinking about, complex systems. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to study all those gaps of animal behavior that we can't fit into, at that time, at least, the current perspective. Keep in mind, this was before, this was in the early 2000s. So at that time, we could not talk about animal sentiment in any way. We could not talk about feelings or emotions unless we had to go through a long process. Every single paper I wrote, I had to describe why I was not being anthropomorphic, as we call it, why it was not me projecting human values onto any animal if I think that it had any kind of emotional stance whatsoever. Yeah. So the level of reductionism that people had at that time. Fortunately, in 2012, that changed. There was a big manifesto at Cambridge University signed by 150 of the most acclaimed scientists in the world saying animals are sentient beings and we do not have to always discuss this anymore. So, but we came out of, the Descartesian understanding at one level, right, that when they scream, it's just like a stimulus response thing. And then behaviorism that had led to, this, whatever is inside any kind of living organism is just a black box and we can't know anything about it and it's not real. All we can study is, the behavioral interactions. So that fortunately has shifted because it was not only a dehumanizing, but I think the kind of lack of value that we put to other living organisms still in our world today, the way that we find that it's okay to treat animals, for example, it is a kind of a reminiscence of that. Anyhow, I wanted to understand why they do what they do, right? So I love just sit there watching them, and I started to notice that there were gaps in these explanations. So, for example, play behavior, which is wonderful to look at, and everybody who's had a dog or a cat or any kind of animal companion in their house will know what I talk about, right? It's fun, it's engaging, you've no doubt that they're playing, and yet we can't explain from the the contemporary scientific understanding, we can't really explain why they're doing it, because it's supposed to either optimize their reproduction rate or their general fitness or survival skills. And social play looks to be fun and engaging, and it's a way of connecting, and there's all kinds of things happening, and we couldn't explain what that was. So I ventured into that domain and wanted to really study, okay, so we have one animal here and one animal here. Look at dogs when they're running around playing and they're doing all these little crazy dog things, and it's fun to watch and all that. What we could talk about at that time in biology was what goes on in this animal and what goes on in this animal, but there was nothing that had anything to do with the context. And when I looked at that, it was quite clear to me, there's some level of transmission. There's something that's going on here that we don't know how to describe. That something became my kind of quest in a way. And to a large extent, it still is. I'm just, trying to dig through the layers of how we can come to conceptualize it, describe it, understand it, make it tangible enough so that we can actually study it well. And we've had several attempts of that, and we're still in the process of figuring out how to best make that more, kind of a more rigorous research process.
Thank you so much for this introduction. And I also can tell by the energy by which you're saying it is that it's so exciting to talk to someone who found their place in terms of what am I here to do. So that's really how I hear your story. And I would like to zoom into this part more about the moods and the feelings. So because your research not just focuses on animals, because we are in this conversation, we're going to move on to systems awareness in education, which is actually mostly about human beings in a context where they're learning. And so in this research that you are doing about moods and feelings and how they interact with the context, what are your findings about the influence on the complex systems that we as human beings, with or without the animals we live with, how does that impact it?
Well, it's a good question, and it's certainly, there's a lot yet to be explored. So just to, I don't actually study animals anymore, because what happened was after I finished my master's, I tried to, in my master's thesis many years ago, I tried to make the kind of the argument that to be social, you had to be emotional. So that was literally the title of my master's. I didn't know anything about education at that time. I had zero clue that there was anything called social emotional learning or anything. So the title of my master's was Social is Emotional. And then after that, I realized, oh, I have to start studying humans instead, because I am never going to get anywhere with trying to, go up against a field like this, studying such radical things. But with human beings, there might actually be a chance. So I wanted to study humans in the same way, in a way that I'd studied animals, not so much all our kind of verbal expressions, but more how we interact, how we come to shape the field, how we're, how moods and feelings are contagious, how we influence each other, all of those things. So that was my PhD project. And Peter Senge, whom I work very closely with, and who was my co-founder at the Center for Systems Awareness, was on my dissertation committee. And so once that was, I had finished my PhD and all the struggles people have to go through to do stuff like that. In many ways. But after that, we started to really explore, okay, so how do we actually want to research this?
Yeah.
And, I've taken a few passes and none of them too successful, and all very kind of, it's just a complicated domain, because how do we make the subtle, intangible context the forefront of what we want to study? You can do that by, you can do that potentially by, asking people about their experiences. But my sense is, and there's a lot of research backing this, that people's capacity for self-reporting is generally very poor.
Yeah.
So one example I kind of usually pull out when people throw all these, questionnaires and stuff at me is like, if you ask people who've just been through an 8-week introduction to mindfulness, they will self-report as way more mindful than people who've had 25 years of daily practice of mindfulness. What are you going to do with data like that, right? Yeah. So we can't. We had to figure out another way of studying these elements, and quite clearly, most people have a very clear experience of being, influenced by the moods of others. And yes, we can talk to some elements of it. We can talk about, empathy and how we're connected and all of that. But we want to really focus on what does it take to create what we call a generative social field. So what does it take to shape the environments, particularly, of course, with our focus, the environments where kids grow up. Yeah. For them to be embracing, nurturing, healing spaces where kids feel safe, they feel seen, they feel heard, and all of that. And we have exemplars that do a really good job, but they're almost always individual teachers, individual school leaders, or little clusters of people who have a set of good pedagogical practices. Now, one thing we can be sure of, and personal stamina and care and all that, but one thing we can be sure of is that this is not dependent on pedagogical practices, because you can have your very old-fashioned teacher who operates in a very kind of a way that could be like 50 years ago, who can create a classroom like that, and you can have somebody who's like your newest project-based learning or social emotional learning program, whatever. And so it's not about that, and we have to kind of figure out what are the boundary conditions for setting up a space like that, so that it's not that we don't try to impose a set of rules and regulations on teachers, but that they find that capacity within themselves so that it kind of fits seamlessly with how they work themselves. And now I'm using teachers in a kind of in a broad sense of, educators, people who are with kids, and so on and so forth. Most of the people we work with are not directly in schools, but are, systems leadership levels. So we work with state agencies, we work with, county offices, districts, so on and so forth, and in many different places in the world.
Yeah. And so as we are transitioning into the human system space and the educational field, and where you mentioned that you're really looking into how can we create these generative contexts.
Yeah.
What I also recall from my discussion I had with Peter Senge is that what we see around us a lot are also systems that are not necessarily very generative, and our context that we all created together, in which subsystems or individuals are not necessarily supported in their in their role, in their being, in their position in the system. And so we end up with certain systems, especially when we look at society now, there's these really big systems that do not allow for a lot of space to generate new things or to learn new things or to expand potential. And
Yeah.
so could you share with us, when you're studying the generative, the one way of doing it is also to see when is it not generative. So how come that we create systems that are not generative in that sense?
That is a very good question. Now, one thing, so when we talk about interconnectedness, it's a very real thing, right? It's not just kind of philosophical orientation. So I like to always kind of just name that, for example, within the field of biology, no life ever occurred in a vacuum, right? It's all interconnected throughout the ages and through a kind of an evolutionary process.
Yeah.
All air on the planet is the same air. We keep breathing, and when I exhale, there are a ton of molecules that you will also at one point inhale and exhale, and so on and so forth. So we're in this space within our planetary boundaries. We're in this space where we are profoundly interconnected.
Yeah.
That goes also for when we talk about systems. So when we talk about systems, we talk about this personal embodied system as one kind of facet, and the social relational spaces that we create as a kind of the next facet on the continuum, and the larger systems that we're all part of also as a facet. So it's not that there's this separated orientation over here of people and individuals and individual organisms and so on, and then there's the social system, and then there's these larger systems out there, which I think is often the kind of the concept that people operate with. The system is something out there and it doesn't work, and somebody is to blame for that. But if you think about this continuum, then you are co-creating also all the things you do not want to see in the world. That goes for all of us.
Yeah.
So that's a good starting point, because the only way we can ever really create systems change is by starting with this particular system here. Everybody who's ever been in a relationship and have tried to change their partner around, or tried to change their parents, or tried to change other people, will know that it's actually not a very easy task, and usually it creates more suffering than it does good. But the system here, we can change this system. It's hard. We're incredibly habituated in our way of showing up. Our personas have been, developed over our lifetime, and most of us have, immense blind spots and cognitive biases and stuff we don't see, and all kinds of, things that we come up across. But the answer is to find there as well. Because I don't think I don't think that there's any kind of coincidence that we're consistently creating, social fields that where we not thrive, where we don't thrive, and that are, we're producing outcomes that we really don't want.
Yeah.
Because we don't know how we do it. And at the same time, we see a growth in anxiety, depression, stress, sense of disconnect, lack of purpose, and so on, particularly, of course, in the Western world. Yeah. And I am very aware that we have made a ton of progress in the world on very many parameters. So, I mean, there's less poverty, there's less warfare, there's less all kinds of things, but there's still an increase in depression and anxiety and suicide and all these things. So, how to balance something like that, if we're, at a materialistic level, actually doing better than we ever had on the planet, than we ever have on the planet before, then how come that we're still suffering at the personal or psychological level? And I think that there's a profound connect there, because when we're in that profound state of suffering or of anxiety or depression or disconnect, we cannot produce, we cannot create generative fields together. We have to come to some level of awareness of healing. This in here needs to be taken care of in order for us to take care of that out there. And when we look at the state of the world today, I mean, this might sound simplistic, it might sound idealistic, all of that. When we look at the state of the world today, my predicament is that, all these challenges that we're facing, particularly the coming generations are facing, which is one of the primary reasons why we work in education. All of these challenges will need to have some anchor in working with the personal individual systems here. Right. Because we cannot go and fix climate change, and we cannot go and fix, mass extinction rates and all of that unless we begin to show up differently. Yeah. And that's a kind of a disconnect in most people's awareness. And that's really what we're working towards.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for this. And so what clicks for me, actually many things sort of are creating and firing in my head when you're saying all this, is that apparently there's a disconnect between our personal systems or our inner systems or our smaller interactive systems and the bigger context systems that we see outside. And we feel like because we are disconnected, that we are not able to influence all these bigger systems at a level that we actually all feel that we should, but somehow not feel capable of doing. And there's a disconnect between, how do I put that? This is actually where the awareness comes up, isn't it? Because it's called Center for Systems Awareness.
Yeah.
And so it's about being aware of how do we create our systems. And the easiest, apparently easiest way to see that is to look at a smaller system, which is your own system, and then see what's required here with me so that I can, with others, co-create systems that are more generative. But I need to know how that works inside me first. Is that how awareness is meant, or is it a different way when we talk about the systems awareness?
It's a good question. And yes, that's certainly some of it, that we have to grow and cultivate our sense of awareness of this particular system and everything that's working and not working, because we are consistently co-creating the social fields, right? The social fields are not magically dumped on us. The societies that we live in are not magically dumped on us. I think people sometimes think that, well, that's just the way our culture has shaped things and that's how it's going to be. And I'm like, well, you do realize that over the course of history, it has looked very differently in very many places, and it can again. But so in nature in general, there's a tendency towards habit formation. Habits are a great thing, right? They conserve energy. It's really wonderful that we don't have to think every morning when we get up, we're like, what is it that I do again? What am I supposed to do? And so on and so forth. Again, everybody who's ever lived with an animal will see that they are super habitual creatures as well. They want to eat in a specific way, and they want to, sleep in this way and that. And some even have dogs that take certain routes at certain times of day and all these different things. So that's that. Our habituation is not a problem. Our habituation, when we have no awareness of it, can be very problematic, because that's where all our internal biases and our cognitive dissonance and all of that exists. That's the realm. There's a when we talk about it, so there's a double kind of, there's a dual thing to this, because when you talk about awareness at the level of the person, yes, it's important. But one of the reasons why we're systems awareness is, so let me back up 2 steps. One of our great friends at the center, who's an eminent neuroscientist, has recently kind of gone out and talked about change your brain and then you can change the world. And I'm like, no, that's actually not how it works. Because unless you have tools and practices and strategies for showing up differently, yes, there is a very profound element to changing the brain that has to come into place and will come into place. But it's always in this contextual setting, because say that we take you and we put you in a kind of a enclosed chamber, and then you go and do all the little practices that will now change your brain, like meditation, and you'll do all kinds of stuff, right? And then you come back out again. What are you supposed to do with that? How do you know how to show up differently, right? Yeah. And that's where the systems, tools, and practices are an eminent guide, because it's not just about making this system work. It's also understanding how to operate with those larger systems. So we use a lot of very kind of hands-on practical tools and strategies for not just the social fields, but also the larger systems. How do we look at, when we produce these outcomes that we don't like, how do we change that around? How do we get to look at what we call the underlying structure of things, right? Instead of reacting to events, we really try to look at the structures that shapes these events in the first place. How do we begin to change events around? What are the artifacts that we should look at, and so on? So it becomes very practical. And I think the real gift of this particular work is that it marries these two, right? It has a deep inner, personal, contemplative aspect to it, and it's very hands-on and tangible and practical. So you actually, when people come through our training, they actually leave with a toolkit that they can go out and do things differently, not just in here, but out there in their interactions and their way with how they lead and so on. And I think without both sides, it's very hard to do anything.
Yeah. And so when we move into this awareness, this ability to not only know how your inner system works and how you influence the social systems and even the larger systems around that, and also to understand the interconnectedness between all of these. It's also about how can we then flip it to a way that is generative, because having awareness is one, but putting it into action is two. And so how did you start like curricula or collaborations or other interactions with people in the educational realm? Because as you just explained, this is why we're so interested in education, because this is one of the bigger systems and a context wherein generating something new and the learning process are things that come most natural to us in education. So how did you start building curricula around systems awareness and the toolkit for action also?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in a way, there are two questions, because one is that we've had a process of trying to prototype, how to come to understand generative social fields. And it's been a kind of a group, including Otto Scharmer, Dan Siegel, Diana Chapman-Walsh, who's one of our advisors at the center and a great friend. Richard Davidson was involved for a while. And so a bunch of us have spent time on creating prototypes to really come to understand, what does this social field stuff, what does it mean? How do we perceive of it, and how can we come to study it? Yeah. So that's been a kind of a track that led to us. We had a large gathering at the Garrison Institute last fall, so in the fall of 2018. And it was interesting. It attracted, I think, 80 or 90 people from at least 20 different countries in the world. And we came together around this, how to actually begin to study this in a more rigorous manner. And it's still, it's still percolating, it's still happening to some extent. But what became more and more clear in this process was that everyone we work with, we have this compassionate systems framework that we work with at leadership level, at school level, at classroom level. We have student groups that work together. We have older students teaching younger students, but it's all within this framework that is kind of the broad umbrella of systems awareness has crystallized into this particular framework that seems to work really, really well in schools in particular. Some years ago, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, the IB reached out to us to hear, how this triple focus thing, which was Peter and Daniel Goleman's little book that came out, how I started to work with them. The IB, the International Baccalaureate, which is an international group of schools, approximately 6,500 schools or so worldwide, have an IB curriculum or an IB program. They reached out and asked, how can we begin to bring complexity into our, how come young people have to go to grad school in order to learn anything about complexity? What can we do about that? And so we went there, and Peter gave a keynote on one of their, conferences, and I was kind of meeting with people, and we were trying to just explore, is there? And we found some incredible partners within that organization, who really had, in a sense, the same kind of aspiration as we do. So for this compassionate integrity to grow and so on and so forth. So we had a series of design meetings at MIT for, I think, 9 or 10 months or so before the compassionate system started to crystallize. And the people who were involved were like, not just Peter and myself, but people, practitioners from within the IB, some of the masterful educators who's been working in systems thinking for many, many years. Mark Greenberg, who's like one of the most eminent social emotional learning professors in the world. We had a bunch of students. We had other colleagues from MIT. So it's just really trying to co-think and co-create something. And it was an exciting process. And eventually it led to Peter and I hosting we put together this toolbox for then, after compassionate system has crystallized, we put together the initial toolbox for what does a compassionate system look like? Because obviously there needs to be an element of capacity building, and our focus is very much on that. People need to learn new things, not just internally, but also all these tools and practices in order to go out and do things differently. And so we had an initial workshop with people from 10 different countries at MIT, and then they went out and started prototyping it. And that's how this framework grew, which is now spread in other countries as well. There's a lot of momentum, and the framework itself is not as such a curriculum, because we wanted it's quite clear that you can teach pretty much everything, all curricular activities, with understanding complexity and having what we call kind of mindful caring perspective woven into that. So we more provide all these tools and practices and hand it over to the teachers so that they can weave it into what they do already. And how those two connect, the social fields, or the generative social fields on the one side and the compassionate systems on the other, is that what we tend to see, and what became more and more clear during this process of prototyping generative social fields, is when people work consistently with compassionate systems, they tend to produce much, much more generative social fields, because there's such an attention to, the care. There's an attention to figuring out how I show up in the system and what kind of impact that creates. There is attention to the larger system as a whole, and the sense of interconnectedness. So for young people particularly, I mean, I think there's such a hunger or a yearning for that, because they need to find their place in the world. And in the compassionate systems framework, you belong here because we're part of this. No matter how we try to, make it go away or pretend that it's worse in other places in the world and it doesn't really have to do with us and all of that. Once we get real about this, that this is our planet and we're all here together, and we have to figure out this collectively, how we're going to, work with these challenges, how we're going to become better at working together and living together and sustaining ourselves over time. Once we become real about that, kids get super motivated, because finally somebody's asking the questions that they, might not even have expressed, but that they feel so deeply, right? All kids that I talk to in all these different cultures, they're severely, troubled by climate change, the implications for their future, poverty, not understanding where they fit in and what they can do. And we can help them with that.
Yeah. I'm just really surprised about the role of compassion in creating generative context and generative processes in our systems. And that the example that you gave and how you did that, it's actually also leading by example and leading by invitation, like the children you talked about who immediately felt motivated and invited to contribute and to learn. And so where do you feel that you are with that right now in terms of influencing the education system? Because I recall that the phrase of education in that sense not being evenly distributed across the world yet, even though there is this change and transformation happening in education, and its role to co-creating systems change, and preparing generations of people to live in this highly interconnected world. So where are we with the educational renaissance, so to speak?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, so at MIT, for example, we don't have an ed school at MIT, but this compassionate systems framework is part of an initiative there called JWEL, the Jameel World Education Lab. And so this is MIT's take on how we want to transform education globally. Yeah. So all the members of JWEL have, access to our training and are part of, can join this compassionate systems kind of movement, or how we want to name it. We have a collaboration through MIT. We have a collaboration just, as an example, with the entirety of the country of Jordan, the entire K-12 education system there. So literally the aspiration is that all teachers will get some level of training in this, particularly around focusing on teacher well-being, because they've been really underserved as a population in the country for many, many years. And Jordan is in this predicament that they've taken in more than 3 million refugees over the last 10 years, particularly Syrian and Iraqi refugees. But what they've done is they haven't just installed people in camps. Most people come into society, which means that the kids are in schools and so on, which means that there's just enormous pressure on that education system. So that's like one big chunk, right? Then we have other places where it's more distributed at the kind of the statewide level of leadership. So like California, we work with several departments at the California State Department of Education, and it's gradually growing there as well, working with, various areas and agencies there who really develop systems leadership. We have a group in British Columbia. British Columbia in Canada is one of the most amazing places to work with systems change, because it's rare to see a system as sane as that. We literally have like the university speaking with the ministry, speaking with the superintendents association, speaking with the principals associations, and we're with them all together, and the superintendents and the practitioners on the ground, for creating a statewide compassionate systems leadership for health and well-being of all kids. And it's just beautiful to track. We were on a call with our core team there yesterday, and it's just very, very moving to see how people are doing these things. So these are just kind of little buckets of things that are going on in different places, just to give you an example. So I'll say it's going well. I have a kind of a sense of urgency, as I think most people do, that, we need to get our act together and figure out a different way of living together on this planet in order for our kids to have a future that is somewhat safe and nice for them to be in, right? And so we created our equivalent of a kind of a master's program. So we have that, and what we're doing during that kind of master's practitioner program, we certify people to become, compassionate systems leaders, so that they can go out and do this work. And so that's our hope, is to help enough people to actually be able to go out and train other people and so on and so forth. My fantasy is that, if we had one generation, if we just had a fifth of a generation of young people trained in this particular manner, the world would look very, very differently. And, it might be a fool's dream in a way, right? And we're so many people on this planet and all of that. But on the other hand, it seems to be growing so, it grows so well, and it has all these ripple effects, because this is, many people recognize this as a kind of an answer to what's needed that we can't quite put our finger to.
Yeah.
And it's not just us. I mean, it's like this entire framework is constantly co-created with everybody who we're working with on the ground. So yeah, I'll say, I mean, at least for my kind of personal level of satisfaction, it gives me hope, particularly when I meet with all these people that we work with and see the work that they do. When I hear how the kids show up, when I hear young people talking about compassion and how they, embody it in a way that, the way we talk about compassion is something that can be learned, that can grow out of empathy, right? So you have to, I mean, everybody has access to it in a way, but it's a sense something that you cultivate. The core of it is, you can say, you don't really have to like people to care about them. You don't have to agree with them to care about them. You don't have to, all kinds of at the personal emotional level, you can let that go because you can still have care for these people. And if we learn that as a kind of a, as a way of how we're being educated for young kids, then I think we could really get somewhere. So I feel quite fortunate to be in this position where I get to work with such incredible, caring and compassionate and just masterful change agents around the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And what you just mentioned was not just about where do you feel that we are with the educational renaissance now, but also a number of different initiatives that you are co-creating with many others to create more compassionate systems leadership in the world that is shaped locally, so that it also can spread and do its work. And I also really liked your brief explanation about what compassion is, and that it's not necessarily just a fuzzy feeling that you either have or you don't have, but that's also a process that you can learn to incorporate in your life, and does not have the usual prerequisites that we think that we need to like or to understand or to agree with people in order to be compassionate and to care. And actually growing the skill, growing the capacity for compassion and care is what's one of the keys or one of the doorways to a more generative set of systems or generative context that we live in. And what I also hear is that how you feel about your role and your contribution that you can make to this bigger development, this bigger movement, so you will, that's trying to accomplish that with the bigger purpose of creating a world that is also a good place for future generations to live in. And I would like to, because we are almost at our time boundary, and I'd like to close off with one more question to you, Mette.
Okay.
And that is, for everyone who's watching right now, who do fulfill leadership roles, or maybe even not leadership roles, but who are, as I know this audience now, is very into contributing to organizational and social systems that really work for us. What is it in terms of systems awareness, or in terms of compassionate systems leadership, that if it were up to you, you would like them to take away from this conversation? So what is it that they can do right after watching this out there in their own context?
Well, I think probably for many people, discovering that it's a skill, well-being is a skill, passion is a skill that you can grow, becoming a systems thinker is a skill, becoming a systems leader is a skill. But all these things are, many people have this tendency to think, well, I'm just not that kind of person. But and of course it's good for us to have, you know, a clear sense of what we can and can't do. But these skill sets are things we can practice and we can become better at. And even little steps will be very, very helpful with that. So just allowing yourself, you know, a pause and breathe and reflect on why you're doing what you're doing, or setting tents for how you want to show up and what you would really like to do with your life. Work a little bit with the sense of purpose and meaning. And that's not just for, you know, that's not just a luxury for people who are in super affluent situations. It's literally something that everybody can have, you know, create more meaningful existence when just attending to these elements. And somehow we've forgotten that a purposeful life is, I think, probably a prerequisite for us to actually thrive and grow in a meaningful way. And it can come in all kinds of forms. So try to not want to change who you are or where you're at, but just look at in where you are and where you're at, what you can, the skills you can grow and change in order to potentially do what you do in a more coherent, in a more meaningful, in a more purposeful, and in a more caring way. I think that those are kind of, you know, elementary first steps that everybody can take. And all of these elements, they are literally skills that you can practice, and you can see the changes in the brain, but it's not enough. You need a set of and strategies as well. So that I think that would be my reply for now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mette. I think that many people can work with that for themselves. And before I say more about that, I would like to say thank you so much for being in conversation with me today. We talked about systems awareness. We talked about education. We talked about how moods and feelings influence our social systems and the larger systems again, and how compassion and understanding interconnectedness can help us to build skills, to work on our skills that eventually lead to a more generative context and better places for us to live and work in. So thank you so much for being here in this Systemic Leadership Summit with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And to everyone who's been watching, suggestions from Mette and also from me to go and share on our online community space any learnings, comments, or insights that you had from this session. I look forward to seeing you there or in the next Systemic Leadership Summit session. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.